I'm super excited that I'm here with you all virtually. I will say I'm a little nervous just because I've never done a hybrid before, and usually I can see my audiences when I'm presenting and I know when you laugh at my jokes. So just laugh anyway, and we'll get through the awkwardness of Zoom and being in a virtual setting. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. And we are talking about unconscious bias. And before I start any training or presentation that I do like to set up some housekeeping and rules of engagement. So first and foremost, you know, we always want to be courteous and respectful of others. Understand that everybody's life path is different, and what led us here today may look different for somebody else. And so understand and honor everyone's experiences and how that has shaped their world. I will be sending out a post-survey link, but I also have a QR code here. So if you could, I do like data, I'm a data person, and the only way that I know how to get better is by asking you your opinions. So if you could get out your phone and scan that QR code, that will take you to a pre-survey. It will take maybe five seconds at most. There's maybe 4 or 5 questions. And then I will also have this QR code at the end for the post-survey as well. Like I said, I really like data, and the only way I can get better is if I get feedback. So open and honest feedback I really appreciate. Okay, so what are we talking about today, and what are we going to do? So we're going to talk about some key terms. We're going to learn about different biases and heuristics. We're going to, you know, have some opportunity for self-discovery. I think that the only way that we can start our path of sustainable DEI awareness and work is through the self-discovery and self-reflection. Hopefully we can get some sort of discussion going as best we can with a virtual setting. But if anyone has any questions during the time that I'm presenting, please let the moderators know, and hopefully we can coordinate with that and we can get your questions going. So what are we going to talk about first? We're going to talk about heuristics. So heuristics are really awesome for our brains in a way that it makes our brains like to code information, right? And we like to be lazy. We like to make shortcuts, and that's what heuristics are. So heuristics are these little shortcuts that we have in our brains, and that helps for easy recall of memory and key facts. This was super awesome and very helpful when we were, you know, being chased by cars or chased by animals, and or we're driving to work and we need to make split decisions. We really like heuristics for that, right? We like those pre-made decisions that we don't really even have to think about. But on the other side of it is heuristics are not always correct. Heuristics, they lay down the work for these categories and for these codings, but they're not always correct, and they often go unchallenged. So there are 3 specific heuristics that we're going to talk about, and these 3 heuristics are what base a lot of our stereotypes and the unconscious biases that we're going to talk about. The first heuristic that we're going to talk about is the availability heuristic. And this is essentially that first impression is the lasting impression. And what this says is that the first thing that I think about when I encounter an outside stimulus, that's what I'm going to remember in my brain. So for instance, if you go to Florida for vacation, you've never been to Florida before, and you're driving around, and all of the drivers there are just wild. Your first impression is, wow, Floridian drivers are wild. As a Floridian, I can say that's kind of true, but it's not always the case, right? But if that's your first impression, that's usually what's going to stay in your mind. And we see this all the time with marketing. This is what we like to know as brand recognition, right? So this is going to be a little awkward just because I'm going to, usually this is a feedback kind of session, but I'm going to show you some pictures on the screen, and I want you to kind of just think in your mind, what comes to mind first? What's your first thoughts? What's your first, you know, what does your brain go to? So here's our first symbol. And so usually when I have an audience that I can interact with, what will normally happen is people will say things like power, or they will say race, or they will say Black Lives, which is all very true. This is part of the logo for the Black Lives Matter. So why I ask this is because sometimes people will say fear, or they'll say aggression, or they'll say anger, right? And really what it depends on is how you were presented this particular stimulus at the beginning, right? So we can see that media has kind of skewed the ways in which this appears, all the Black Lives Matter protests and that sort of thing. And so we can kind of see that depending on how you first encountered one particular group is going to be how you continue to think that group in your mind. Okay, here's our second one. And a lot of times the first responses I get are Republican, Southern, guns, obviously, because it's in the in the title. One time I got patriotism, but essentially we get the point, right? So there is a specific, you know, thought that we all have when we think about the NRA, and depending on where you are in the country, in the world even, it will affect the way that you think about it. And depending on the first time that you have encountered it, or maybe someone from the NRA specifically, that could definitely skew the way that you view that group. For instance, the first person that I met in the NRA was my grandmother, who is a bleeding liberal, and which is a very weird thing here in the South, right? That's not as common. But a lot of times when people have talked to me about their first encounters with someone in the NRA, it was someone that was, you know, part of the hunting club and that sort of thing, right? And so it just depends on how we get that information first, and if we ever go to check to see if it's, you know, the standard or not, if that's accurate. All right, and here's our last one. Now this one is super pertinent right now, right? A lot of times the first thing that I hear is pride. I hear LGBT, I hear same-sex marriage, equality. I also hear, you know, Hawaii. I once got Hawaii, that one was new. I did not realize, but the rainbow is like part of their license plate. So that was that person's first recollection of a rainbow. But definitely we see this a lot. As a person who is in the queer community, whenever I see this specifically, my brain immediately says, this is a safe space for me. Whether or not that's actually true, you know, remains to be seen. But that that heuristic that I have, that availability heuristic, has shown me before my first encounters with the rainbow was an okay experience, right? So just kind of, you know, want to think about when you encounter new stimulus, when you encounter new experiences or people of different backgrounds, different walks of life, understand that that person is one person and they don't always, you know, aren't always the standard. And we see us and our brains wanting to make that standard through this representative heuristic. So I love this example here, but essentially what the representative heuristic says is if you have a certain number of criterion met of a specific stimulus that I've coded in my brain, I'm going to associate you with that pre-existing coding. So for example, on the side here, we have this, it's actually called the anatomy of a hipster. And essentially, if you're not familiar with hipsters, is kind of a millennial subgroup. We tend to like obscure things, but mostly because they're obscure. We like coffee, overpriced coffee with oat milk. We're often wearing flannel. We have illustrious glasses, that sort of thing, right? So that is a stereotypical, you know, description of a millennial, right? And so if you have this in your brain, and let's say you go to a coffee shop downtown and you see someone sitting in the coffee shop and they've got plaid flannel on, they're, you know, got a million different coffees around, you know, they're sitting there with all their stickers on their laptops. So you're going to assume, oh, well, based off of a couple of these key characteristics, you are also a hipster. That's not always necessarily the case, right? We have to understand that one person is an individual, and they don't necessarily represent an entire group. So we just have to keep in mind that we're not wanting to compare, what we're seeing in real life to a previous example. We don't want to lump someone together into a group that they don't participate in, or they're not part of, or an identity that they don't actually, identify with. We want to make sure that we're seeing people as individuals, right? And trying to avoid this representative heuristic. All right, and so the last heuristic that we have of our three is called the affect heuristic. The affect heuristic, you see this a lot in marketing, and it is shown that when you present stimulus or you present new information, depending on the way in which it's presented, can create an emotional trigger, and that trigger can cause a state of mind, and a repeat state of mind. So I've got some examples here up at the very top. You can see this is a public announcement, safety announcement ad. We see these all the time, right? These smoking cessation ads trying to get you to stop smoking. And a lot of times their strategy is through fear, right? So they present to you this image. You can see children is in bold red, so that grabs your attention. And then you can see in the cigarette here, as the cigarette is burning, life is kind of, being smoked away. And what this is trying to say is, I'm assuming, I don't have kids, but I'm assuming that if you have kids, you want to see them grow up. You want to be there for them, right? At least I'd hope. But if, when you think about it that way, what it's trying to say to you is, if you smoke, you may not have this opportunity to see your children grow, which creates this fear within you. And what it tries to do is create this lasting fear, this lasting impression. Studies have shown that this doesn't always work. It's the same thing with, when vegans try to make you feel really, really bad about eating animals because they're just really, really cute, right? Like that's not a very sustainable reason. But that affect heuristic is very helpful in a moment, just because, our brains are quick and we react without thinking and without processing it. We also see these in political ads all the time, right? Regardless of your political affiliation, you can see ads on either side trying to invoke some sort of emotional state, right? So with this one here, we see Mike Bloomberg. Behind him, he's got a couple of folks who look visually diverse. He's hugging this child, so I'm thinking that he's trying to signal hope, or that he's in touch with the younger crowd. Whether or not that's true, we don't know, but you can tell this image is trying to invoke some sort of hope. And what their campaign is trying to do is associate that feeling of hope, that feeling of we can get things done with this candidate. Whether or not he actually can do any of the things that he promises, that remains to be seen. But a lot of times what marketers, what folks will prey on is that you will not check these heuristics that you have, that you will not examine these biases that we're going to talk about, and you make decisions based off of those preconceived notions. So what are unconscious biases? Well, our brains are really great, and they have this amazing capacity to compute at amazing speeds, right? We are an incredible species, and our brains are so capable of really great things. But we're really lazy, like really lazy. And so our brains have these two patterns of thinking. One is deliberate and one is autopilot. Now, autopilot, it's great, right? This is where we tune out. I don't even have to think about my route to work. I don't know what happens in the 7 minutes between me getting into my car and me getting out of my car, but somehow I get to work every day. That's awesome, right? I don't want to have to, contemplate every single turn, every single stop on my way to work. That would be exhausting. We'd get decision fatigue. It wouldn't be great. None of us would be productive. But deliberate thinking, it does require a lot more processing power, right? We need to have more power to be to process through our thoughts. We need to have the opportunity to sit down and think about things logically, which takes a little bit of time, right? Depending on how you process information, it can take a long time. And so what our brains like to do is we like to avoid the deliberate thinking and tend to just hang out in the autopilot. And as I mentioned, autopilot's not terrible, but it's not where we want to always be. Because a lot of times the thoughts that come from our autopilot are untested. They're biases and stereotypes that we have just committed to memory and have never once challenged it. And so we could be wrong. And I know I don't like to be wrong, so I would assume that you guys wouldn't either. And that's why I think learning about biases and trying to start checking them and get out of that autopilot thinking will be very beneficial, especially on your work for DEI, inclusion and all of that. So there are a lot of biases that have been researched, and we don't have time to do all of them today. But I have picked out a couple of them that I think are the most common and the most prominent, and we'll talk about them together here now. So the first one, and I think the one that I see the most often, is called confirmation bias. So confirmation bias essentially says, I am right, and I'm going to find information that supports my opinion. And if anything goes against my opinion, I'm gonna call it fake news. I'm gonna throw it out. This is not okay, right? We see this all the time. We see this in Facebook where people will post articles that have a headline that will support their cause, and that's not actually doing research. It's not actually using factual information to base your information off of. So we see this on Facebook. We see people going to websites that are particularly slanted one way or the other, getting information from one particular news source or another, not actually checking the facts and going back to the actual study or the actual event that happened. We also can see this in a biased interpretation of facts or information, right? So as you start to surround yourself with this echo chamber of information that supports your claims, that supports your opinions, you're going to start interpreting facts in a biased way. Data is just data, right? It's always funny when people are like, oh, is the data good? Is the data bad? What does the data show? The data just is, right? And it's how we interpret those facts. But if we have unchecked unconscious biases that are skewing the way that we're interpreting information, we could end up making decisions that are not completely, successful or that don't actually solve the problem that we're working towards. And the last thing that we see this in is our recollection, right? So this kind of plays into those heuristics that we have, right? Of we've seen something, we've seen a hipster that looks this way every single time. So now anytime that somebody says something about a hipster, I'm going to only think about it this one way. And the memories that I have associated with that one experience will affect every future experience that I have with someone who is a hipster or not. So the second bias that we're going to talk about is called the self-serving bias. Now, this one is one I think that we should all become a little bit more aware of. I know for me personally, this one is one that I deal with a lot. But essentially what this says is that things that happen to me that are good are directly because of the work that I did. Things that happen to me that are negative or are not as desirable are the effects of outside sources. They're other people's faults. Now, one way, we see this is I like to put together the traffic conundrum, right? How many times have you, overslept or spent too much time on Facebook in the morning and ended up becoming late, and you're on your way to work and you message your boss and you say, oh my goodness, you would never believe the crash on Bob Wallace. The traffic is just, it's awful. It's back to back, bumper to bumper. Never once do you say, boss, sorry, I didn't leave early enough. I'm part of the traffic. I am the traffic. We always just assume it's everybody else's problem. Everyone else is getting to work at the same time, and they're the reason that we're late. It's never because we did something, right? And so why this is a problem, First of all, it dehumanizes everyone in your world, right? So it basically sets you on this higher pedestal of you're the person who can achieve greatness, and everyone else is someone that's trying to bring you down or causing you negative outcomes, right? And that's not okay, because then that turns it into a us versus them, a me versus the world, when we know we are a collective humanity and we all are on this rock together. Secondly, what this does is this relinquishes personal responsibility, right? So it's not my fault that I'm late because all of these other people decided to leave at the same time. It is, is not my fault I'm late at all. It is the person in front of me, that soccer mom, you know, I see that she is in the lane in front of me. She pulled out in front of me. It's her fault. No, maybe it was because you didn't give yourself enough time to get to work. Maybe you didn't take into considerations that there's traffic or there's construction on a particular road that you're taking, right? So when we relinquish our personal responsibility, it's easier for us to ignore problems and oftentimes perpetuate those problems, even if we're unaware of them or unaware of our perpetuants of that problem. And finally, it creates a double standard, right? So as I mentioned with this traffic problem, you are not the traffic. Everyone else is. But how many other people in the same lane that you're in are also on the phone with their boss saying, oh my gosh, you can't believe it. The traffic is just terrible. Everyone is claiming this, right? And so it eventually it causes this, well, who's actually to blame for this? Nobody. We're all using the roads. They're all there for us. It's just our lack of planning. So we just want to make sure that we are becoming more aware of that. And ways in which we can combat this bias particularly is treating ourselves with grace and also treating others with grace, right? We want to anticipate negative outcomes and understand that they are going to happen. And it can be a multitude of reasons why something happens. And the way in which that you process that and those negative outcomes is by being honest and having some self-awareness. And also, you know, as we are, you know, processing through these and understanding that, oh, it's not just everyone else is doing the bad things to me, you know, maybe it's part of me, we can start to use some empathy towards other people and recognize that everybody else is also late to work and we are the traffic for them too. All right, so this one is really cool. This is called the Barnum effect. And this one, essentially what it says is, you know, the things that are generic information, I can apply them to me because I'm special and it is about me specifically, right? So we see this with BuzzFeed quizzes, right? You know, back in the day, you know, it was like, well, what kind of potato are you? And you would ask, or you would be asked a bunch of questions that had nothing to do with anything in particular, and it would give you this, oh, you're a hash brown or you're a tater tot, and you would read it and you'd be like, oh my gosh, that is so me, I'm such a tater tot. And then you would share it to your Facebook and everyone else would share it and be like, oh my gosh, girl, you're such a tater tot. How did this happen, right? It's a generic statement that we have somehow, our brains have somehow convinced us to believe, and we take it to heart. When we see this, you know, with personality quizzes and ads as well, you know, we'll be on Facebook and you see something that just seems so specific for you. Nah, it's not because of that. It's because they have a lot of different information from you. They're using heuristics and different sorts of code about you to make something personalized. But I can tell you there's probably 20 other people within the state that have the same demographics as you that probably get those same ads, right? But we like to believe that we're special. We like to believe that things are made for us. And they actually did a study on this. So what they did was they gathered folks together and they were told that they needed to write a paper. And this paper, you know, it needed to defend their opinions. It needed to be well written with grammar and all of the conventions. It needed to be perfect, right? So the participants wrote their papers and turned them in. And then they were given feedback Each person got feedback on their papers, and then they were told to rate the feedback. Was the feedback relevant? Was the feedback, pertinent? Was it helpful? Did it, provide, constructive criticism? And a lot of the people, a majority of the people in the study actually said, yes, this feedback is 100% me. Well, the secret to the research project was everyone receives the same feedback. Literally everyone, regardless of what paper they wrote, every single person in the study got the same feedback. But a resounding majority of the people in the study were like, yes, this was totally about me and my paper. So it's interesting, we want to be, cognizant of this and understand, like, generic information, it's there and it's there to be interpreted, but it doesn't necessarily have to always apply to us, right? And we see this with zodiac signs as well. We see this with personality quizzes and tests. So I have two people up here on the screen, and I just want you to think about them. Both of them are in the running to be the new office manager at my company. And these are their top 5 strengths. So with Jane Doe, we can see that Jane is hardworking, ambitious, responsible, pragmatic, and organized. Awesome candidate. Both Jane and John have the same amount of experience. They have the same degrees, but these are their different skills, right? And so John, we see he is passionate, creative, loyal, dynamic, and self-aware. Now, I always like to ask my live audience, okay, first off, which of these two do you identify with most? So think about that. Some people, I've had people be like, I am a diehard Jane Doe. That is totally me. And other people are like, yeah, I can kind of see myself in either. And then I ask, okay, well, based off of these two, if everything else is even and the only difference are their two or the top 5 strengths that they have, who should I pick as my new office manager? And I get a couple of people who are like, well, duh, Jane Doe, because Jane sounds, that's a lot of great characteristics of an office manager. And other people are saying, oh, well, John, he's got that really great passionate creativity to connect with other people. So he would be a better office manager. And I've had people debate on this, right? But it turns out both of these people, this is just generic information based off of a zodiac, right? So zodiac, the astrology, right? Based off of, the days when you were born, kind of makes this whole personality profile of you. We see people applying zodiacs to so much of their stuff, right? So the new trend now is, oh, we matched on Tinder, send me your birth chart, right? And it's really incredible. People can make decisions based off of this generic information. I have a friend who has an app on his phone, and every morning he checks it and he says, oh, well, Mercury's in retrograde today, so I better not go to the bagel shop, right? How do you think that this is information that's relevant for you? But it's incredible that our brains are able to process this and make this okay, right? So we want to be aware of this, and we want to start to see through, not everything is about us. Not everything is all about just us. There are other people on this planet too. Okay, so the Dunning-Kruger effect, this one is really cool and takes a little bit more to explain. We see this a lot lately, especially now that confirmation bias is so easy, because we can share information that is very, echo chamber-like. But essentially what the Dunning-Kruger effect says is the more that you know, or the less that you know about a subject, the more confident you're going to feel about it. And vice versa, you're also going to think that you know more, and so you will have this bravado about a topic, and you will pretend that you know more than you actually do. And so where the problem is with this is that we have people that, one, don't actually understand the full scope of a problem, and two, don't know that they don't understand the full scope of the problem. And so we have these people that will parade around as subject matter experts when they actually are just at this very tip of peak stupid, or amount stupid right here, right? And so we see in this little chart here, as you start to gain confidence and you don't have a lot of wisdom, you're going to stay up here. And eventually there's going to be a tipping point, right? You're going to meet someone that's like, actually, you know, that fact is not true, or they'll provide you information that is contrary enough to shake you in your core and make you realize, oh, maybe I don't know everything about this. And you'll start to kind of plummet down into this valley of despair. And we see this all the time. You know, we don't like to feel wrong. We don't like to feel out of the know. And so when we do have these moments where we realize, oh my gosh, I don't know everything, it kind of breaks down our world a little bit. We stop feeling as confident. We start to doubt everything. And what's important is that we don't want to hang out here in this valley for too long, right? You can go one of two ways. You can kind of, you know, get discouraged, and just kind of, you know, dig your heels into the ground and commit to staying in that valley of despair and not learning anything new. Or you can start to go on this slope of enlightenment, right? So starting to seek out alternative information, or trying to research a particular topic that you don't know about. Maybe there was one particular, you know, facet of this problem that you didn't even know existed. And so now you're going through this research phase and trying to get to a better place of understanding. And essentially, you know, no one is saying that we have to be subject matter experts on everything, but we do have to understand that our scope of learning is limited for specific topics, right? I'm never, ever going to claim that I know how to do brain surgery. There's no benefit for me for that. I could, you know, maybe get a little bit of the clout from the confidence that I get of like, oh yeah, I'm a brain surgeon. But eventually, you know, I'm not going to be able to do anything with that. There's no point of me to parade around as an expert in that when I know what I do well. This is what I do well, and I don't want to have to pretend anything else, right? I also don't want to be in this cloud of unknowing, and I want to learn more. So when we, you know, think about problems, complex problems, we have to understand that there is a multitude of factors going into this problem, and that just one news article doesn't, you know, reading that doesn't make you an expert on it. You have to do a lot of research. You have to actually intentionally get into the nitty gritty and seek out the research that is being presented. Okay, so positivity bias, we see this oftentimes, and there's also a flip to this one as well. So everything I talk about with positivity, we can also see the flip side with negativity bias. But positivity bias essentially says that everything is perfect and we're doing so great. And where this is a problem, you know, we see this a lot with, you know, thinking, oh, we're super diverse here. You know, we have a lot of people in our team that are from different backgrounds, when in reality, no, they're not actually, right? And so what we do is we have a tendency to report positive reviews of reality when in fact it's not actually true. We also will have positive associations with, you know, memories, with information. And then we'll also start to see that information in a positive way. We'll take that confirmation bias and we'll start to, you know, have that biased memory recollection about it, and we'll start to favor it positively. And all of the same goes for the reverse of this, a negativity bias of thinking that everything is more terrible than it actually is, holding negative views, expectations, and memories, and you know, avoiding positive information, or, you know, favoring negative information to feed that that negative bias. Where this is a problem is it causes a wall. It prevents us from being able to see the actuality of what's going on. So for instance, you know, we talk about this at UAH a lot. We want to be a diverse campus. We want to have diversity all throughout our campus. And yet when you look at demographics, you see upper level, you know, folks in administration, and they tend to still be all the same race, right? There's only, a couple of folks in the mid-level range that are different races or different nationalities or different sexual orientations. And so while we have all these people on our brochures that make us look diverse, we have to be more critical and get past this positivity bias and be honest with ourselves. Are we actually a diverse and inclusive and in welcoming space? Do people of all walks of life have the opportunity to progress in their careers? Do we see a better breakdown of folks in different positions, right? Not just, one type of position, like for instance, facilities or working in hourly positions, right? We want to see people in all walks of life in all different ranges of the organization. And so without having that positivity bias, we can start to be more honest with that and be more honest with our own organizations and see, oh, maybe we're not as diverse as we say we are. Maybe just because we have that brochure with a bunch of people of different colors, maybe that doesn't mean that we're actually diverse. So we have to get past this positivity bias to look at that and be more honest with ourselves. So in-group bias, essentially at its core says that we like sameness. Homogeneous groups are our bread and butter. And we see this all the time with our own personal circles of trust. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you guys write down, you don't have a handout because we're virtual, but you're going to write down or think about at least 6 people in your life. These are people who are not blood related to you, but they're people that, if you needed a shirt off your back and they were the same size as you, they could give you that shirt. Or you were locked out of your house in the middle of the night and you could call on them and they would be there. Think of these 6 people, and if you have something to write with, write their names down, and I'll give you a couple minutes to think about that. For me, this is hard because I don't have a lot of friends. So it's hard for me to think about 6 people, but if you can get at least 3, that is good. 3 to 6 people, but think about them, write their names down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call out some different diversity characteristics, and we're going to go through them and kind of see how different and how same our groups are. So I'll give you just a couple more minutes to think about your names, and then we'll move forward with the different facets of diversity. Okay, so hopefully you have at least 3 people on your list. I know it's kind of hard. Well, I want you to look at your list, and if the person on your list is the same race as you, I want you to put an X by their name. So if they're the same race as you, put an X. If this person on your list is the same gender as you, put an X by their name. If the person on your list is of the same nationality as you, put an X by their name. So you're from America, they're from America. You're from Germany, they're from Germany, etc., etc. Okay, now think about the people on your list, and this may be a little bit deeper, you may have to assume, but if the person is the same sexual orientation as you, put an X. So if they're the same sexual orientation, you may have to assume, maybe you know, maybe you don't. Okay. If the person on your list has the same level of education or higher than you, put an X by their name. So if you have a high school diploma and they have a high school diploma, put an X. If you have a high school diploma and they have a doctorate, put an X. And last, if this person has the same religion as you, put an X by their name. Now, you don't have to go into like the different spindles of Christianity, right? Like Southern Baptist versus other Baptist, I don't know. You don't have to do that. But like, you know, if you generally believe the same things, put an X by their name. You may have to assume, you may not. So now I want you to look at your list and be honest with yourself. How many of the people on your list actually, you know, have 4 or more X's by their names? And what this activity does, it kind of shows you this, right? Like we don't really think about it. We don't think about this in-group bias. That's why it's an unconscious bias. But what our brains do is we tend to prefer sameness. We like to surround ourselves with similarities, right? It's why church is so great, right? Everybody likes to go to church because they know it's a place where people can come together who are like-minded about a certain topic, right? We see this all the time. There's nothing necessarily wrong with in-group bias on its own, right? Going, you know, just having this preference for sameness, that's biologically how our brains are wired, right? But where this becomes a problem is when it becomes an exclusion, right? So we have this bias and we're unaware of it, and we start to favor people in our circles, the people who look like us, the people that have the same facets of diversity as us. We see this a lot with hiring practices, right? So we have to make sure that our HR reps are aware of these biases that they have, that they will tend to prefer sameness, even if that person isn't as qualified as somebody else. We have to become aware of this and you know, not necessarily target and go hunting for people of diversity to include in our friend groups, but we do need to become more aware of this, right? Because the more that we're exposed to difference, the more that we're exposed to you know, different ways of life, the more that we become enriched humans ourselves, right? Like our world wouldn't be the way it is. We wouldn't have jazz music and, you know, fusion Tex-Mex food without being without breaking down this homogenous groups, this in-group bias. So, you know, I don't do this activity to make you feel bad about your friend group, not at all, because if I'm being honest, mine tends to look pretty homogenous as well. And I'm not suggesting that you go, you know, hunting. If you see that your group is all white people, don't go hunting for, you know, a brown friend. Or if all of your people are Christians, don't go hunting for a Jewish person. Like, that's tokenism. We don't want to do that. But we do want to become more aware of it and start to see that, you know, the ways in which we interpret the world happen to be influenced by the people that we hang out with. And that group of people can oftentimes be influenced by this in-group bias. We just want to become more aware of these and start to, you know, challenge them, and, you know, maybe extend an olive branch to someone that you may have not considered to be a friend before, or you know, considering changing your hiring practices, or ensuring that you are being more diverse and avoiding this in-group bias. So the last bias that we're going to talk about, I've kind of combined 2 into 1. So we have the curse of knowledge and the hindsight bias, and they kind of go hand in hand in this, that when you learn information, your brain somehow gets into this like, I am superior, I know all, and you forget that you were actually a novice and that you didn't actually know this information prior. And so what it does is it basically says, oh, well, I knew that already. And you start to, it almost kind of villainizes people who don't know things, or who are still on their journey out of that valley of despair. And so we want to just, you know, understand that learning does take time. It is a lifelong process, and it is oftentimes the more difficult road, right? We could totally just sink into comfort and dig our heels into the ground and resist any new information, or, you know, we could take that leap of faith and learn about a new subject, or learn about something that makes us uncomfortable because we don't really fully understand everything about it. I always like to say, you know, life is a learning process, right? We don't stop learning just when we're legally able to exit the public school system, usually 16, right? Like if we stop learning at 16, we'd probably go to jail for tax evasion because we don't know how to do taxes. We'd probably never be able to purchase a car, you know, boiling water, making cereal. A lot of those things comes as an adult as you get into the world. And if you commit to not learning, or you, you know, just assume that everything was so obvious to you at the beginning, it does create this wall. It creates this, you know, resistance to change and resistance to new information. And so with this twofold, we want to, you know, treat ourselves with grace and understand that we're all learning and this is going to take time, but also everyone else is also learning, right? There's no point of villainizing anybody, not even yourself, for not knowing things. You know, now that you have learned about these biases, you can't, you know, you can't use that, oh, I didn't know anymore, because you know now. But you know, there are opportunities in life where we can learn something new that may have been uncomfortable before. But if we had just approached it with a, you know, a better, a more graceful, you know, open-mindedness, maybe that information wouldn't be as alarming to us, right? And so overall, when it's coming to unconscious bias and trying to figure out how do I get past these? Okay, now I know like my brain isn't as solid as I thought it was. There's a lot of things influencing my decision making. What do we do? How do we move from there? Well, what I like to suggest is getting yourself a devil's advocate. I will be the first to admit, I hate to be wrong. Like it makes me sweat. Like I feel physically uncomfortable when I am wrong. And there is something about having to admit that I'm wrong that is just so irksome, and it's very humbling, right? And we all tend to feel the same way. I don't know anyone who's like, yes, I was wrong today. No one ever is like that, right? But it's important that we have those moments, because as much as I want to believe that I'm always right, I'm not always right, right? And so what we do when we have someone who is this devil's advocate, they can challenge us. They can challenge our assumptions. They can challenge our beliefs. Even if they are actually on our side, it gets us to think about, you know, okay, I think about this subject this way, but what if I approached it from the different side, right? And so having that different perspective can allow you to see a subject a lot more broadly and kind of, you know, see past that tip of the iceberg, past that peak of Mount Stupid that you tend to stay on at the very beginning of learning about a new topic. I have a friend who, like, I know that he tends to be pretty similar with views on things with me, but he will actively argue with me on everything. Like it's to the point where it's like, man, you know, it's a beautiful day, the sun is out, the sky is blue, and he'll be like, is it blue? Is it blue? Is that really blue? And I have to start thinking about it. I'm like, well, actually, you know, it does kind of look more gray now that I think about it, right? But if it wasn't for that, you know, that presentation of a different thought, I would maybe never challenge what I think. And, you know, that's the whole point of learning, is learning both sides of things, learning all sides of things, and making your own opinion from there. But you can't do that if you're never challenged, if you're in this echo chamber of people who just think like you all the time, right? I say this, you know, to my friends, I appreciate that we can argue and disagree and debate, because if all of my friends thought exactly the same as me, then I'm not learning any new perspectives. I'm not learning a different way to solve a problem, or learning that there are different problems in general that exist, right? And so, you know, you want to, you know, break down that in-group bias and get yourself surrounded with some people who don't necessarily agree with you, or who can play that devil's advocate for you. So for the sake of this being a hybrid virtual, we won't actually talk about these today, but I'm going to send a follow-up for all for all the folks who have attended this. This is Project Implicit, and what it does, it's a Harvard study, and you can go online and they have a bunch of different topics that you can do, and they're all on your computer. I do recommend doing them on your computer, but essentially what it does is it tests your implicit and unconscious biases, right? So you'll be presented with, for instance, I've taken one about age. Right. And so I went into it thinking, I respect my elders, like I'm cool, I'm totally cool with old people. And as I took the test and I got my results back, I recognized I had a slight bias to younger people. And this totally makes sense in our culture, right? Because, you know, youth is the ever eternal capitalistic mover here. Like everything is about being young and chasing your youth. And the way we treat older folks in this country is you know, it remains to be seen. And so it makes sense that I had this bias of preferring young people. So Project Implicit is really cool. And it does kind of give you like a mirror into yourself, and you can kind of start to examine the different biases that you may have. Even if you think like, oh man, you know, I'm totally okay with age, right? That doesn't bother me. I recommend trying out a couple of them that you think that you aren't biased about, and then go for a couple that maybe are on that list of ones that you may have some biases about. Understand though that this is not a perfect science, and everyone always comes back at me with, well, is this really valid, or is this reliable measure of method of measurement? And to that I say, you know, this is a national program, right? And so we have a lot of people participating in it. It's not perfect. There is never one 100% valid and reliable measurement, but it does help, right? It does start to get people to think about these things. It may not necessarily, you know, the results don't need to be set in stone. They don't necessarily make you a good or bad person. You know, biases in general don't make you a bad person, but knowing about them is the first step, right? Having that self-awareness. So when you do these on your own, just think about what it's like to take the exam. You know, were there any test results that you thought were surprising? Did anything, you know, confirm what you thought? Can you see any, you know, connections between the results that you have and the biases that we've talked about today? You know, just start to think about those. I recommend sharing this with your friends as well and getting them to talk about it, because it's really cool when you can, you know, chat with somebody else who's taken this exam or these exams and see, oh, well, I thought this way about this, or this was my experience with it. And, you know, just learn another perspective, even with this particular resource. So at the very end of my presentations, I tend to like to end with a yes and, or an okay now what. And so essentially what I want to leave you with is unconscious bias and combating biases takes effort. It is a lifelong process, and it is essential that we have self-awareness, grace, and honesty with ourselves, right? We have to be able to hold ourselves accountable and to challenge our assumptions and not let our brains just run rampant on autopilot mode. That's not where we make progress as a society. We have to understand that to combat our biases and to be better people and to have, you know, sustainable DEI work, we have to value others, and we have to, you know, seek out points that don't necessarily we agree with, that may be contrary to the information that we thought was true. We have to go into it understanding that we may be wrong, and that's okay. As much as it sucks to feel wrong, it's okay to be wrong, right? We have to take responsibility of that as well. And how we do that is by engaging in constructive dialogue with other folks and getting those perspectives. And we have to, you know, recognize, like, we can talk about topics without getting angry. It is possible. I know it is. I do it in everyday life, right? We can talk about difficult topics without personally attacking other people, right? We can do this. It's not very difficult, as long as we start to recognize the ways in which our brains are processing the world is definitely, you know, part of it's out of our control with this unconscious bias that we didn't know about. And one thing that I want to talk about specifically too is having unconscious bias doesn't make you a bad person. At the end of the day, biologically, psychologically, unconscious biases are there, and they are ways in which our brains have processed information. As I mentioned, they are heuristics, they're based off heuristics and stereotypes. What makes you a bad person is when you have these unconscious biases and you act on them in forms of discrimination and prejudice and oppression, right? So having an unconscious bias on its own does not make you a terrible person. It's what you do with that unconscious bias, right? So I will admit I have unconscious biases. This is my job, right? 100% of my time is spent to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I still have biases to this day, right? For instance, I'm a Floridian, and I can tell you I have a lot of biases about Alabama just because I was from Florida, right? And what's important is that I don't discriminate against people because of these biases I had about Alabamians because I'm a Floridian, but learn to understand, where did those biases come from? Are those biases even real? Do those biases actually matter? And should I engage in this behavior this way? And that's how you hold yourself accountable. That's how you become a better steward, a better champion for inclusion, how you become more, you know, intentional with how you are interacting with people, and understanding like, oh, I do have a lens over my face as well, and it is impacting the way that I view the world and the way in which I interact with this world. So that's all I had. I know this was, you know, a little more just right at you because it's a little bit difficult to talk, you know, back and forth. But if you could go ahead and take that post survey or go ahead and scan it. But did anyone have any questions or comments or like to add to anything that I talked about today? We can do like a Q&A if we need to.
Anyone? The hangouts? Yes, Katie, he was asking, I have someone asking if it's possible to get handouts, like, so the slide deck.
Yeah, so I won't be able to share the slide deck with you just because it's part of university property, intellectual property. However, I will send a follow-up that has a bunch of resources, including that implicit associations test, some additional reading, and where I got all of my information for the biases and heuristics that I talked about today.
Perfect. Yes.
I loved her presentation, and I was wondering if she would be able to do something for maybe a SHRM organization in the same format, and could we exchange information.
I will send you the link to our UAH's link where you can fill out the request out.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That was a great presentation. It would be wonderful for SHRM.
Can you hear them, Katie?
I can kind of hear that you're crushing on me a little bit, but I can't fully hear all of the praise. So I appreciate that. If anyone is interested in having some sort of presentation or collaborating, I can also send my information out in that follow-up email to all the participants.
Any other questions for Katie?
Awesome. Well, this was super great. I hope it was great for y'all. I mean, I couldn't really see you. I hope you laughed at my jokes. As I mentioned before, if you could take this post survey, this one is a little bit more in depth, but it shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes at most. But please let me know how I did. If you liked the pace, if you liked the content, what I can improve. I can't get better unless I have feedback. So I really greatly appreciate that. I will also send a link to this survey in the follow-up as well. So, you know, be on the lookout for that. I really do appreciate your time when you take that survey. And I will, again, send that implicit bias test as well. Those are really fun. I recommend doing at least 3 of them. It takes maybe 10 minutes for each of them, but they are very helpful and very, you know, one of those aha moments that we tend to look for. Awesome.
Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. I am sorry for all the technical difficulties at the very beginning. Thank you for being patient as we work through those. And we very much appreciate you being here with us today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. Y'all have a good rest of your day.